Hello everyone, good evening from Australia and good morning, good afternoon from wherever you are dialing in today. And welcome to our sixth session in our series on multidimensional wellbeing measurement. My name is Kate Solis and I'm dialing in today from the lands of the Yuin people in Tathra, Australia. And I'll be hosting the session today alongside my colleague Travis Chamberlain.
Hello.
We are incredibly fortunate today to have Dr. Karen Scott presenting on the topic Knowledge Politics, Multidimensional Wellbeing Indicators as Policy Instruments. I know that the use of multidimensional wellbeing indicators for policy is an issue that many of us here today have considered, and so I'm sure it's a presentation that we'll all get a lot out of. I will introduce Karen in just a moment, but before I do so, I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping matters. So as noted before, this is the sixth session in our series, and all our previous sessions have been recorded. So if you are interested, please go to our website, which will be posted in the chat shortly, to view our previous sessions. We will have plenty of time for a Q&A session after Karen's talk. So please do enter any questions you have in the Q&A box at any point during the webinar. You can also choose to upvote the questions of other questioners by clicking on the thumbs up icon. Sebastian, Raphael and Jacob are in the background now, and they'll be going through these questions throughout the presentation. Please also be aware that this session is being recorded. Finally, it would be really great for us all to connect with each other as much as possible in this virtual platform. So please do let us know in the chat box where you're dialing in from and what your research interests and disciplines are. Now I would like to introduce Karen. Karen's research focuses on the politics of knowledge and evidence for policy. She has researched the international interest in measuring quality of life or wellbeing for public policy, particularly focused in the context of the UK, US and New Zealand. She has worked in and alongside local and central government to improve evidence for public policy on wellbeing and sustainability issues. This includes a research fellowship in the Strategic Evidence and Analysis team in DEFRA, and working as part of the ESRC Centre for Evaluating Complexity across the Nexus. She is co-editor for the Palgrave Macmillan book series, The Politics and Policy of Wellbeing, and her publications include Measuring Wellbeing Towards Sustainability and The Politics of Wellbeing, Theory, Policy and Practice. And from a personal side note, I highly recommend those two publications for anyone who's interested in this area. Related to this research, she also teaches undergraduate and postgraduate courses in the politics of knowledge and theories and governance of the good life from classical to contemporary times. So Karen, I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Kate, for that nice introduction, and thanks so much to the HDCA for inviting me. So I'm going to share my slides now, and I'll talk a little bit about what I'm proposing to do this morning. Okay, I hope everybody can see those. So I've titled this presentation Knowledge Politics, and I guess it's difficult to not preface any presentation at the moment without a nod to COVID and what we've all been through in the last nearly 18 months. So for me, that's given me quite a personal look at wellbeing, as I'm sure it has for all of us. If we weren't already doing that as wellbeing researchers, it's quite impossible to research wellbeing without reflecting personally on your own life, I find. And I've been researching wellbeing for about 15 years, 16 years, something like that. But COVID has really brought some of my feelings about wellbeing, my research, into quite sharp focus, particularly around social justice issues, and also challenged quite a lot of the research that I've done before in quite profound ways, and I'm happy to talk more about that in afterwards. But I think it's given me a time to reflect on what I've done in the last 15 years and where I want to go next with wellbeing. And really, I've realised that all of my research, that the main interest, the thing that intellectually excites me about wellbeing measures and indicators, if one can get excited about indicators, is knowledge politics. It's about how power and knowledge and discourse interact in the production of indicators for public policy. So I've got really interested in knowledge politics and done quite a lot of work on that this year, including looking at epistemic injustice, which is a concept that's been around a little while, but fairly new to me. And I've been doing quite a lot of reading on that recently. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end. First of all, considering the audience and the organisation that I'm presenting to and for, I'd like to just preface this talk with a couple of pieces of research that I've done that do use the capabilities approach in particular ways. And also to say that I do try and insert the capabilities approach into my undergraduate teaching. I do feel it's an approach that's underrepresented in politics courses, and I do teach that. I think it's for me, I discovered this this approach early on in my PhD, and I've always been very struck by its usefulness and relevance, and the sort of resonance that it has with the way that people themselves talk about well-being. Okay. Okay, so when I was being asked to talk to you today, Kate and the team sent me a number of questions that they thought it might be useful to cover for you in terms of well-being and policy. So how well-being measures can help to guide and support public policy. What are the challenges and barriers for governments to incorporate well-being measures in the policy cycle? How to increase policy impact? Why some governments are more willing than others to use well-being as a measure of progress, and the value of democratic process in determining indicators. So I'll talk to, so, you know, there's a lot to unpick there, first of all. These are really big issues, and one can easily get overwhelmed with how to put these in a short presentation. So the way that I'm going to do it is, as I said, just to talk about a couple of pieces of my past research. And then I'm going to talk about, for people who don't know, and I'm sure there are people in the audience who have far more expertise than me in working in policy and with policymakers. So I don't presume any knowledge, and I don't want to undermine knowledge either. But I thought it might be useful just to outline some key theories about the policy process, and to just sort of dispel a few myths about how policy works or doesn't work. And then we'll go from there. And I'm going to tell a few stories about my engagement with policy. And that reflects my interest in narrative and storytelling as a powerful way to impact policy. And I'll talk a bit more about that later on. Okay, so, and I'm going to leave a lot of discussion time. So I'm hoping to finish this in 30 to 40 minutes. And leaving a lot of time for discussion, because I think that's often the most productive part of workshops. And I'd really love to hear your questions. Okay, so going right back to my PhD, and then my monograph that came out of the PhD a few years later. So measuring wellbeing towards sustainability. So this was, so I was working in a local authority part-time, 3 days a week in the strategic development team. And I was tasked with developing wellbeing indicators through community participation, which sounded like a really nice project and fairly straightforward. Of course, it was not that at all. It was ESRC funded, so I was working as well as studying my own work for my PhD. So it took me 4 years to complete, and it was very involved and lengthy process, as you can imagine. And right at the start, I felt that so working with some of the people in the strategic evidence, in the strategic development team in evidence production, I was bombarded at the start of this project with sets of indicators: economic indicators, environmental indicators, well-being indicators, health indicators, social cohesion indicators, poverty indicators, you know, you name it. It was all thrown at me. And in a very sort of technocratic way, I was expected to sort of sift through all of these indicators and come up with a well-being indicator set. And of course, I realized very quickly that that is really not how things can work or should work. it's not a technocratic exercise. It's very much a consultative exercise, an interpretive exercise. And I insisted on that all the way through the project, and that created tensions. And this is all written about in my PhD and in the book. I also felt very strongly right at the start of the project that I wanted to focus on specific groups and projects because I'm very interested in contextualizing well-being measures and well-being research. I've had many, many tense discussions with other researchers about how to contextualize well-being research. And I know that that's something that this organization and this webinar series is really interested in. I felt that often well-being indicators, at that time it was quality of life indicators that were promoted by central government, not necessarily well-being indicators. And they were focused on local areas. So we had local quality of life indicator sets, which were very much focused on community cohesion and green spaces and keeping the locality working properly. And I felt that these indicators were very much speaking to an average person and creating a phenomena that, although they speak to everyone, speak to no one in particular. And that often these indicators speak past our lived experience, so they're too general to really say anything meaningful to us or for us. And so I wanted to focus on specific groups. So I did focus groups, and I also worked with children, young people in community college, people not in residential care, that was ethically too difficult to achieve, but elderly people who were visiting day centres. I worked with a Bangladeshi community, very small community of Bangladeshi people in this particular local authority in the northeast where I was working. And I'll give you one example of the things that I'm talking about. So in this particular authority, there was a real pride in community cohesion. So one indicator that was commonly touted as being excellent was the indicator that 93% of people in this locality, in this borough, got on well with their neighbours. So this was the indicator. Do you think people in your locality get on well? And 93% of people said yes, they get on really well. But that wasn't reflected at all in the interviews and focus groups with ethnic minorities, with gay people, with migrant workers living in the borough. The stories they told me were of quite extreme exclusion, homophobia, racism, and one Bangladeshi family had to actually move because they had eggs thrown at their door and all of those types of things. So some quite violent and horrible things were happening, which was completely missing from this account. And so since then, I've really been focused on exclusions and who are we speaking to? And when we're talking about well-being, whose well-being are we talking about? And so it's really important, I think, to contextualize and look at the experiences of specific groups, look at specific issues in our life course, because the issues we have changed throughout our lives, and specific projects and contexts. So since then, I've been quite interested in knowledge politics, I think, without using that term in my PhD necessarily, about whose knowledge is excluded, whose everyday experience is excluded in the measurement of wellbeing indicators, because wellbeing indicators are presented as being fairly neutral, sort of gender blind, race blind, sexuality blind, etc. But they're not neutral at all, actually. And in that sort of presentation of neutrality, they really make certain issues invisible. And that's what I got concerned about. I also got really caught up with the nature and role of indicators in public policies and how these are measured, how they're conceptualized, measured, what methodologies are being used, and how those research tools, instruments, again, exclude or include. And so I wrote about, you know, the prominence of positivist methodologies over more interpretivist, you know, qualitative methodologies. And that's still something that I'm concerned about today, although things in policy have got a lot better since I wrote my PhD in terms of acknowledging different research methodologies and looking at a wider selection of research outputs. And there, as I said before, there was a real strong focus on technocratic exercises to develop indicators. So people with expertise would come together, whether that was in statistics or economic evaluation or whatever the expertise was. These people would come together and develop indicators possibly through a survey, through collating existing indicators into a new set, etc. And I really rejected this. And being a mature sort of postgraduate student, I had the confidence to do that through experience in my previous work in the voluntary sector. So I really held my ground that, and again, that produced a lot of tension in the team. But I really pushed for the deep engagement of local stakeholders because I knew that I knew from my own experience, and I knew from all of the reading I'd done about the role of indicators, was that if indicators are to be in any way valuable to public policy, they have to have deep engagement of local stakeholders. They have to be relevant politically, and they have to be politically legitimized by local stakeholders in order to have any hope of gaining traction in the policy world. Obviously, robust technocratic research is valued by policy. I mean, that's been the sort of gold standard for a long time in policy. So that is important in terms of legitimizing it within that expert field, but without dramatizing sort of indicators, dramatizing the issues, getting people in talking about stories. That doesn't catch hold. There's no media attention. There's nothing to sort of catch hold in the public imagination, and that's what really fuels sort of issues moving forward, is public pressure on government. If nobody cares about indicators, there's no real reason to respond often. So that's been written about all the way back to Sustainable Seattle, which is a sort of, you know, the sort of iconic community indicator. At that point, it was sustainability indicators, not well-being indicators, but these all get merged and overlap. But one of the key messages from that project was to dramatize indicators, to get local people involved, to get them to care about indicators, to write indicators in a way that people understand. So not about, you know, the scientific equations about air pollution, but whether you can see the mountain in the distance on a clear day or not. So dramatizing indicators in particular ways and narrating them in particular ways is very important. And as Judith Innes, who's a key researcher working on indicators in public policy, and I've read her work extensively. So Judith Innes, her work on the history of the economic indicator in the US is really interesting and quite amusing, actually. So before unemployment was measured in the United States, and this was obviously decades ago, before unemployment was measured, people knew that unemployment was a problem after the Great Depression. They knew that lots and lots of people were unemployed, and this was a huge social problem, but without the evidence and the numbers, it was difficult to talk about this in policy. So basically a group of people just made up a number, and and that then started to have some traction because people went, oh, that's terrible, that's a big number, even though everybody was surrounded, you know, lots of unemployment people were around. So I think her work is very instructive in terms of dramatizing indicators, getting the public attention, getting them in the media, we all remember, well, some of us will remember, not everybody will be old enough, but remember Maggie's Millions, when the 3 million unemployment mark got hit during Maggie Thatcher's reign, and the Sun newspaper, which is the biggest circulation newspaper in the country, had the title Maggie's Millions. And so that indicator became very dramatised. Unfortunately, things like economic indicators and unemployment indicators are very powerful politically, well-being indicators less so. So it's about how to get those seen as very important and in the public domain. So of interest to this audience, perhaps, oh, sorry, I need to go back. Of interest to this audience, I did all of this qualitative research with local people, with policymakers, with different groups of local people. We did lots of consultations in sports centres, in the local shopping centre. We had lots of big conversations with individuals and groups about well-being, and I didn't prescribe that in any way. I didn't ask them about domains of well-being, about your work. I asked them in very open questions to tell me about what they thought well-being was and what it meant to them. And I sort of had a massive job to collate all of that qualitative work into a sort of framework of well-being. And I mapped that against two indicator sets, or two other sort of instruments. And one was not an indicator set, it was a Nussbaum Central Human Capabilities. And I was interested in some of the things that she had listed there as being quite important and really missing from other indicator sets that I had seen. So although hers wasn't an indicator set, I did want to do that mapping. And I also mapped my data against the local quality of life indicator set, which was promoted heavily by central government at the time. So this was in New Labour, the New Labour era, around 2007, 2008. And I found very strongly that Nussbaum's Central Human Capabilities resonated very closely with what I had gathered in terms of what local people said. And there was an almost complete disconnect with the local quality of life indicator set. And so that was very instructive for me. I became even more interested in the sort of failure of indicators in a way to really capture and speak to everyday experience. Okay, so the other piece of work that focuses on the capabilities approach was a piece of work I did from an AHRC knowledge exchange project, where we were looking at the value of rural arts projects in terms of well-being. And at that time, this was in 2016, so this was sort of Cameron's administration, the first one. So there'd been a lot of, and of course he brought in the national well-being measure and all of that. And there was a big focus on new techniques to use subjective well-being measurements to do cost-benefit evaluation on arts projects, because the arts were struggling under austerity against budgetary cuts and trying to defend their value. So there was a lot of work on cultural value and a lot of work on the economic and well-being impacts of culture, arts and culture. So we looked at that in a rural area, and this paper responds to that agenda. So there was this intrinsic instrumental argument binary of cultural value, so that, you know, cultural value is intrinsically important to people, doesn't matter how much it costs, or, you know, the economic benefits are irrelevant. It's part of what makes us human. Culture is all around us, and we need it, we can't escape it, and we actively desire cultural activities. And then the instrumental argument was that under austerity, a lot of culture and arts were completely cut. In Newcastle, where I was living at the time, the local authority, it's called doing a Newcastle in cultural fields, completely cut the arts budget. And that was very striking, with the argument that until we can show that the arts actually create money, we have no money to fund the arts because we're in austerity. So arts and culture were the first things to get cut during that time. But this was really a false binary, I felt, between intrinsic and instrumental, because arts do both. And it became a bit of a sort of cul-de-sac argument, really. So we were interested in bringing in a sort of different lens, and we used, again, Nussbaum's central human capabilities to argue for assessing cultural value through that lens, and coming up with slightly different ways of narrating and conceptualizing cultural value. And very much critiquing, as termed, the new tools of wellbeing analysis, so the big excitement about using subjective wellbeing indicators at the time to show that, you know, per head, per pound, you know, museums made people happier than, you know, a certain number of pounds. So there was a lot of that sort of work going on, which was heavily critiqued, including by us. Okay, so that's one example of how subjective wellbeing research and measurements was being used in policy in the ways that I personally think, and a lot of other people think, are sort of a bit regressive. Okay, and again, I can talk more about all of these things. I'm just sort of whizzing through to sort of just flash certain issues to you that you can then pick up and we can talk more about. Okay, so I thought it might be useful to just look at the policy cycle, seeing as that was mentioned in one of the topics for discussion suggested to me. So the policy cycle has been around for decades, the idea of the policy cycle, since the 50s. I think it was Laswell who first talked about it in 1951. I might be wrong about that, but it's certainly been around for decades as this sort of gold standard in how policy making should work. So starting with the rationale, so this is the issue or the problem you want to address, and how to get it on the political agenda. And then, you know, developing, so if the political agenda decides that this is an issue worthy of creating policy around, then the objectives are set, appraisal happens. So this is a process of looking at different policy options. So what do we do about given this issue and the objectives that we want to achieve? What policy option would be the best thing to do? There are a number of things that we could do as a government: tax people, incentivize people, do some research, all sorts of things. What policy options are there that are suitable to match these objectives, and let's assess them. And then, do we do a control? Do we, you know, there are all sorts of things we can do. And then implementing that policy and monitoring how it goes, and then evaluating, which is a key thing that people have identified that doesn't happen very well often in government, to evaluate a policy and learn from those lessons. Quite often that's the bit that's quite weak. And then feedback to policymakers, again, communication in a sort of feedback loop is often weak. Back to the start to develop a new policy cycle to improve, trash, change the policy that you've already implemented. So this is the sort of ideal cycle. And of course, it doesn't work like that, to the extent that a few years ago, the Cabinet Office actually said, we're not going to use this cycle in the Cabinet Office anymore because we don't really believe this is how it works in reality. And the Institute of Government, and this is the when I was working in DEFRA in 2016, this is the cycle that they used, and it's called the Rome. It used to be called Rome, and then they added an F on for the feedback loop. So Rome F cycle. And certain departments will still use variations of this, but it's largely been questioned, discredited as Halsworth et al. Say, the Institute of Government, in a big study they did in 2011, so that's 10 years ago now. This idea of how policy is made is divorced from reality, and the lack of realistic processes leaves too much in policy making to chance, personality, and individual skill. So there's been a sort of crisis in policy making, and certainly when I was working in DEFRA in 2015-16, there was an awful lot of talk about, in fact, I was working in the policy evaluation team, working on how evaluation can impact on policy in a better way, because that was a really weak area, that people learning from previous mistakes was really weak. But that's only one issue. There's a whole lot of other issues that there's no time to go into today. But suffice to say that there was a bit of a crisis in policy making, and I'll run over some of the issues now very briefly. But again, we can come back to some of this stuff. So changing policy, I don't need to say, you probably know, is really tough. Even to get something on the policy agenda requires legitimation by a wide number of people. And that goes right back to Judith Inner's work again. I can't remember I should have written this down, but I can't remember the name of the researcher, but there was a researcher in, I think it was the 70s or 80s, talked about the sort of policy agenda as an ecology, and that different species are fighting for prominence. And it's like that with political issues. There's all sorts of political issues that need to get onto the policy agenda, that need to be discussed in policy settings and made decisions about, but not all of those will be able to fight for prominence. So only very few issues get on the agenda at any given time. And it's often those issues that, again, have been widely discussed in the public domain, that the public are concerned about, that there's some crisis about, or that there's some problem to solve in society that's risen above the others, that the media are focusing attention on. And these are the issues that often get onto the policy agenda. That's a huge simplification. And one of the key theories about when issues become relevant to policy is Kingdon's theories of policy stream, theory of policy streams. So there are three streams. So he talked about problems, policy, and politics. So problems are, when there is a crisis, when there's an issue that becomes relevant, that needs addressing. Policy is having the legitimization and the correct sort of policy appraisal to actually address the issues. Without that, you can't address the issues. And politics is having the political will, very simply put. So the right political agenda where this issue can gain traction. And these three streams, so Kingdon says that two of these streams are necessary to even have any hope of getting issues on the agenda, but three streams are optimal. And research that my colleague Ian Bache, I've worked a lot with Ian on various publications and on an ESRC seminar series on the politics of wellbeing. So Ian Bache and Louise Reardon wrote a paper in 2013 looking at this policy streams theory in terms of well-being measurements getting on the policy agenda or gaining traction, or well-being being a thing even for policymakers to discuss. And they found that the problem stream was weak, so that the measurement of well-being is not particularly well articulated, and for this issue to advance further up the political agenda requires the construction of a more common narrative and the problem that well-being indicators might address. So there'd been a huge political will from David Cameron's first government to create wellbeing indicators. I mean, he was very much pushing for the Office of National Statistics to create a national wellbeing measure in 2011, which they did. And very, very keen, and I think authentically quite keen on this agenda. And it was linked into his ideas of the big society and people doing things for themselves, which I've written about in a paper and critiqued. But Ian and Bache and Reardon were arguing that well-being wasn't really enough of a problem. There wasn't really a problem for well-being to address as such. And so it was failing to sort of take hold in policy. And I know from the workshops that we took part in during the ESRC seminar series that we ran. And we had some key policymakers come into that and help us with that, including somebody from the Cabinet Office who was in charge of wellbeing research at the time, and Paul Allen, who we still work with, who was the head of the ONS Measuring National Wellbeing program. So he was really a great person to have in that series. And there was huge policy and political drive to make wellbeing more relevant and to create measures and indicators, but it failed to sort of take a wider hold. In fact, was often a little bit mocked in wider society. And although individual departments had tried very hard to figure out how to use wellbeing indicators in their policies, that some of those were finding them less relevant. So the indicator set, the multidimensional indicator set that the ONS produced, which had 41, I think, indicators in it, measuring different aspects of wellbeing, it sort of failed to take hold in a way, or at least at the time. That's what policymakers were telling us. And of course, since 2013, other issues have fought for prominence in the agenda, or didn't really have to fight. We had the financial crisis and then austerity all through the sort of early 2010 to 2016. In 2016, we had Brexit, which has been certainly in the UK, has been heavily dominating the policy space. And now we've had COVID. And so really, I feel, and other people in the audience might disagree, because I've been a little bit out of the loop for the last couple of years, but I would be really interested to hear from anyone who's been engaged with more centrally with policy in the last couple of years. But my feeling is that those issues have become so prominent that wellbeing has become a little bit sidelined or squeezed out, or different administrations. So Theresa May's administration, for example, wasn't that focused on wellbeing in the way that David Cameron was, and Boris Johnson perhaps not so much again. So the sort of leadership has been important as well. And then, but I think out of COVID, there's been created a new moment for wellbeing to gain traction. So there's been a number of recent reports about how the public want to build back better and do it differently. As I said at the start, personal awarenesses of what's important in life have come much more to the fore. Certainly for privileged people in the Western world, of course, there are a lot of people who have been surviving in issues worse than COVID for a long time, and I completely recognise that. But in terms of a sort of UK or Western privileged society, the issues of surviving a sort of fatal threat have really come to the fore in a way that they never have before for us, and for many of us anyway. And so I think that that's created a moment where wellbeing can gain prominence again, and certainly there has been a lot of talk about that in the media and in the public domain. So the hashtag Build Back Better is one example of that. And you might be interested in a blog we did for the LSE COVID blog with my colleague Nick Kersop-Taylor on that, just a little piece. So changing policy, any policy is difficult, but I also want to talk about the changing policy shifts over the short, medium and long term. So of course there are continual policy shifts due to electoral politics, and as different administrations come in with different ideological positions. And the civil service is seen as a counterweight to this sort of ministerial positioning. So they're seen as the sort of safe hands against the dangers of ministerial, sort of vicissitudes. And in fact, the civil service does do that, but it can also stop innovation, stop, transformation happening. A minister comes in with a new idea to radicalize, something, and the civil service, in their nature, and I totally respect this, being a little part of them for a short time, very impressed by their professionalism, but they can act as a sort of, a safety, such a safety valve that they proceed with extreme caution. So it's often quite difficult to change things very quickly. Counter to that, things can change very quickly if the minister says you need to do this. So there are various complexities in the way that things can change quickly and slowly in politics. And again, no time to go into the nuances of that. The changing nature of policy over the long term. So if we look at post-war policy making, that was very much driven by a rational policy making model. So policymakers as experts in their field, who maybe have been working in departments for a long time, had built up sort of experience and expertise in their particular policy specialism. Excuse me. Just keeping an eye on the time, realizing I've already talked far too much and I'm not even halfway through my slides. So yeah, so that's changed completely. And as I said, there's a little bit of a crisis in policymaking because policymaking expertise has been really undermined in recent years by all sorts of things. But very interesting articles are coming out now about open government, about transparency in government, open data, so how big data is being opened up to the public by government departments. So public agents and NGOs and other people can actually get hold of this data and analyse it themselves and challenge government on their research or their policies. And all of this, of course, has happened through digital media and the internet and social media. So moving from open government to e-government, and then, as Linda says, to we government, because so many new stakeholders are piling in and using these new platforms to really democratize policymaking. And that's produced a little bit of a crisis within policymaking about how to ensure quality and how to work with stakeholders. So policymakers increasingly being seen as stewards over a diffuse network of policy stakeholders, not as experts creating policy themselves necessarily. And new ideas about institutional cultures and narrative are coming to the force. There's a lot of policy churn. Policymakers are encouraged to move from department to department now to build their career as we move into more neoliberal sort of ideas of career building. Some departments are seen as less worthy or less sexy than others. So there's a lot of churn, and there's a real problem with lack of institutional knowledge within departments. So the idea of producing institutional cultures rather than institutional memory and narrative as stories as a way to hold knowledge much more powerfully, because stories get passed much more quickly than research does. So these are interesting ideas. Okay, I was going to tell 3 stories, but I'm just going to limit it to 1, and I'm going to talk about, let's think, I'm going to talk about big data in the royal wedding, because that's the most recent one, and it allows me to have a bit of a rant about well-being and well-being indicators in marriage, which is a little pet hate of mine, and even more sort of relevant at the moment because I'm about to enter into a civil partnership in a couple of weeks. So I'm going to talk about big data in the royal wedding. So obviously, as I've already said, big data is out there, it's accessible by people, and it's being used in all sorts of innovative and sometimes worrying ways to research well-being. So one of the stories I'm going to tell you is I got chatting at a train station by somebody in the cabinet office who was working on well-being. And we had a nice coffee, and then he invited me to the cabinet office to look at some research they were doing on textual analysis because of my interest in discourse analysis. And when I went to the cabinet office, he brought down the computer that he had all this data on. And what they'd done was they had looked in the previous year at a huge amount of social media postings through Facebook and other media platforms to look for utterings of happiness. And they collated all of this data through coding texts. So every time the word happy was mentioned, or joy, or some similar coding, they collected all of these utterances and they analysed them. And he told me that the happiest day that year was the day of the royal wedding of William and Kate. So that was in, I don't know, 2014 now? I can't remember. And he said, so that sort of shows us, doesn't it, that people are still, the public is still sort of into the royal family, because that was also the time when the royal family were going through, lots of stuff. So, people still support the royal family. And we had a big discussion about it. And I said, well, people might support the royal family. That might be what's making them happy. But there was also a national holiday creating a 4-day weekend that weekend. It was also sunny. People also got together to watch the royal wedding. So even if they were into the royal wedding, it could have been the fact that they were getting together as families and sharing an experience, having food and drink together, that was making them happy. So I found all the way through, and this is the point I was going to make in the other two stories, that there's been this sort of illusion of correlation and causality in a lot of well-being measures and the way that they've been interpreted. And marriage is one that has been quite heavily politicized, I would say. So the idea that marriage makes people happier is that there's a correlation between marriage and happiness in some early well-being research. And so particularly the conservative narrative is that family matters and the family values, and so marriage matters. After all, marriage makes us happier, and married people are happier than cohabiting people in long-term stable relationships. So that was some of the research that was coming out, looking at the links between marriage and well-being. In fact, that research was quite flawed because it wasn't looking at certain aspects, and new research coming out looking at different aspects of social support shows that it's the social support people get in marriage and in long-term relationships, however they're legitimized, that create the happiness, not the marriage itself. But the way that marriage was sort of promoted as a sort of value because of well-being was quite striking early on in various workshops that I attended. And I thought this was incredibly problematic, ideologically and ethically, and in terms of methodology as well. So I'm going to just very quickly talk about epistemic injustice. So I've been interested for a long time in who's excluded in terms of conceptualizing and measuring well-being, going right back to my PhD and asking well-being for who, and whose voices aren't we hearing, and whose understandings aren't we getting. And so Fricker and Medina are two scholars who've written a lot about epistemic injustice. Fricker from an analytical philosophy point of view, and Medina from a critical race and gender studies point of view. And Fricker identifies two types of epistemic injustice. So testimonial injustice, when somebody's excluded because of their identity, for example, women excluded from mainstream politics. So politics doesn't reflect the all-round lived experience of women over a number of decades. And then hermeneutical injustice. So this is culturally based, when knowledge about issues are incomplete. And the example that is given is that before the 1970s, domestic violence wasn't a thing. It wasn't a thing that we discussed. There wasn't even a term for what happened in marriages, except maybe disciplining your wife or some other type of thing. And that made it very hard because there wasn't even a phenomenon that was discussed or recognized. It made it hard for women throughout history to get justice on, or even to recognize that injustice was being done to them. So I would like to go forward and try and apply some of this work to the ways that well-being measures are conceptualized, produced, implemented, and how that affects public policy and the policy processes itself. The methodologies, the research it uses can be very epistemically unjust, I believe. But this is emergent work. I'm just flagging it up for discussion, really, selfishly, because some of you might have good comments to make for me going forward. And so, yes, I've just said all of that. My interest in context-based research and identity-based research and issue-based research is really about connecting with those knowledges. And lots of work, people have done work on, qualitative gathering of knowledge with specific groups. But we don't have any systematic, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not aware of any really large-scale systematic review of qualitative, the huge, body of qualitative evidence that's been done to inform policy. We have sort of bits of it, but really we should have that, and that qualitative work is incredibly important for surfacing those invisible issues, those invisible voices, and creating more justice around the development of wellbeing indicators. So I'm going to stop there. And yeah, I'm really sorry. I knew I would do this. I just rabbit on far too much. I've never learned not to, because I get so excited about these things. So I'm going to stop there and hear your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Scott. So I'm going to jump in, and I'll be switching off with my colleague Kate, asking some questions and inviting questions from our audience. Really, as you said, more of a workshop, perhaps. Yes. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I would like to encourage members of the audience to ask whatever questions they have on their mind, and we'll do our best to either seed your question by reading it directly or invite you to join in and kind of get a more collaborative conversation, which I think resonates with this topic. Like, how do we create that kind of forum where people can discuss stories, ideas, and values, and really come to an understanding of what it is that's important? You mentioned Fricker, and I find myself thinking also of Iris Marion Young. I wonder if you're aware of, so that the idea of how to allow people, as you've said, how to allow people to have a stake, those who have a stake to have a seat at the table. And then I would also ask, and maybe this is a bit selfish, but maybe I'll lead in with this question, and then we'll cede to the questions that have been asked so far in the Q&A. How do we also give influence? So you've mentioned all these different complexities of the political process that enables the creation of policy, and is also intertwined with the way that something like well-being or quality of life is defined, and then what indicators are selected. A theme that has resonated throughout this series is the idea of allowing stakeholders to, I guess you said, kind of evaluate or give feedback, but then also reshape the process. And I'm wondering if you could comment on what have been some mechanisms that you have seen that have been helpful in allowing that process to occur, so that the feedback seems more authentic, or it actually captures the values that seem more relevant. For example, having the right kind of support system instead of just celebrating the royal wedding.
Okay, so I haven't read, is it Iris Marion Young? But I will look her up. Thank you for that.
Justice and the Politics of Difference, just to see the title.
So I think for a long time I was just very frustrated. I think outside the sort of qualitative research done by social scientists and others with particular groups, and Sarah White's work in the development context. So we can learn a lot from that sort of work, because that work's been going on for a long time, sitting down with people in their own communities, not prejudging issues and questions, but keeping that very open, and developing a discourse around what's important to that locality, that group of people, what's important in this project. So that hasn't worked very well I would argue, in policy in Britain, at local level or at national level. And I think the reason is that it's very hard for people to get outside of the mindset of being responsible experts and this idea about empowering the local community to come to the table is a sort of framing that's very much within that mold. So community development workers in local authorities, they used to be them. I don't know whether they still exist, but community development workers were doing really all the groundwork in local authorities, building relationships with people, hanging out in the streets with young people, really actually having those long-standing relationships of trust. And it takes a long time to build trust in communities. And policy makers want things quite fast often. So those sort of development of relationships and relationship building that we know is really important, not only in policy, but also in terms of working with communities. And to break down those barriers, people in communities are also policymakers or policy stakeholders. So we're seeing now a real breakdown of all of those framings and those sort of conceptual ideas about how policy is made. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing that policy is in crisis, because I think in times of crisis, we change and transform, even though it might be very uncomfortable. And I take care when I say that, to acknowledge that crisis is horrible for many people. But as I said, we're seeing this sort of huge explosion of social media and involvement in policy making and different ways to think about policy and real innovation, so crowdsourcing money to challenge policy and other things. So I think that I really think that's great. I really welcome that. So it's not so much about giving people a stake at the table. It's really about how to deconstruct the concepts of policy that we've sat with for decades, and be comfortable with a wider notion of democratizing policymaking, I think. So the things that I found have worked really well are not getting, it's actually hard to find an example in this country that's worked really well. That's what I'm struggling with. I think there are some really good research projects, but I can't think of a project that's really involved a diverse group of stakeholders in a really innovative, in-depth way in terms of well-being research and indicators and policy in the UK. I can't think of any, and I would really like people in the audience to tell me if there is such a thing.
Okay. All right, thank you. And it's we have a number of questions at this point, so I'm going to bring in first member of our audience, Patricia. We're going to see if we can get your mic turned on, and you're welcome to ask your question.
Let me see. Hello, can you hear me here?
Yes, Patricia, I can hear you. Hi.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Karen, gosh, so thrilled really to have been able to participate. What a delight. Thank you very much for such a wonderful all-rounder. It is true. My situation is I was a mature student with Sarah White, and she enabled my curiosity. So I did a tiny little bit of research in a master taught. Now I find myself in France precisely as where do I take it from here? Because, for instance, well-being is a word that does not exist as a concept as such. The equivalent is very difficult to translate. I am fluent in French and Spanish, so I know about the word, el buen vivir, the concept of Séverine de Nolan, that, Yeah. So your approach today precisely touches on what is dear to my heart and where do I take it from here matter, on possibilities of taking a project that would have to deal with policy, involving qualitative indicators, So perhaps at some stage we can link up. Now, the questions to you and the comments will be the following. I would expect precisely 2 main points you've touched in, again, dear to my heart. You talked about the COVID. So I would expect that COVID and health, and I'm talking health for all ages here, and irrespective of background, would seem to have the potential diminishing competing policy issues. Would you not agree? That's the first question. And the second one, a well-being lens, as for what you have shared with us, including the no-spam approach, would, I would think, have a more holistic and long-lasting benefits, regardless of the politics of policies. What are your thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, so on the first one, so I couldn't quite hear you when you were asking that bit of the question. So were you asking that during COVID, health and well-being have more traction? Do I think they have more traction on policy?
Putting it bluntly, I would think that COVID and health joined together as concepts would seem to have the potential to diminish competing policy issues. So if indeed there are groups that are using those 2 concepts for helping to churn, as you put it, the politics and the policy making, do they not have the potential to diminish those competing issues, since everybody moves around?
Yes. So as I sort of briefly alluded to in my talk, so there are those narratives in the public domain very, very strongly, obviously, as well as social justice, because the people who have been suffering the worst health effects are certain groups of people who are marginalized already from mainstream society often. And so the health and social justice, I think, has risen to the fore quite strongly in a lot of forums. And certainly local governments, if not central government, are taking that very, very seriously. And I know some local governments in London are doing quite a lot of research work around that. I think slightly different to that issue is the Build Back Better agenda, which is also gaining prominence and quite strong. And there have been some pieces of research about what matters to the public going forward after COVID, and that they want the world to be a better place. They want their lives to be better. They're reevaluating all sorts of things. And I think this is really where the whole wellbeing agenda started, not necessarily about health. And Sarah Atkinson in Durham has written a lot about the elision of health and well-being in quite interesting ways. So if you're interested in that, you should look up her work. Yeah, I mean, well-being really started as an agenda to counteract the panic about neoliberal economic systems and how they were backfiring to produce ill-being in all sorts of ways, and lack of sustainability, ecological impacts, etc. So the Building Back Better platform, I think, really speaks back to that moment, and I think there's value in promoting that and getting involved in that, because I think there is a moment where that can rise to the fore, but we'll wait and see. I think at the moment, the government is still dealing with the sort of disaster, and we'll have to see what happens afterwards, and it may take a change of government. On the wellbeing lens and the holistic lens, absolutely. I mean, holism is something that I'm very keen to assert in all of my work, and that's why I like the capabilities approach, because it has much more potential for holistic ideas of wellbeing. Often we have wellbeing measurements that compartmentalize aspects of life. So, your social, your employment, your etc. health, and these so-called wellbeing domains is a very sensible way to split up complexity and to have a handle on things, but it does create a number of silos when you're talking about your life, because of course all of these things are interrelated, and we don't really have a good model of a complex interrelated life that we can measure easily. And so unfortunately we do tend to have this rather compartmentalized view of life because we're trying to measure it, and that sometimes can work against the desire to produce holistic measurements. So yes, absolutely, using the capabilities approach can do some of that work.
If I may, just a quick one on this one. You mentioned domestic violence. Domestic violence, even in this Western world, has definitely become a thing. And domestic violence, as of late, particularly in the UK since 2017, has been promoted as something that is definitely a no-no, and economic abuse was the latest part of this domestic violence thing. So perhaps the audience, if interested on that one, might choose to look into that, because I have been following that. Interestingly enough, that also has to do with the rest of your life. And congratulations on your next situation.
Thank you. Yes, my daughter actually volunteers for a charity that supports domestic abuse victims. So yeah, she's been telling me about some of the new research, and it's very shocking. So yes, thank you very much for that, Patricia.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Karen, for those answers, and Patricia for the great questions. We have a lot of questions coming in, so I might just move directly to the next one. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Tehendra, are you able to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for a very intriguing presentation, Karen.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm a PhD scholar from Global South. So currently I'm working with a forest dwellers community in India. So my opinion, my question was, when you were in your research, you have used a policy framework to articulate the well-being indicator. So in your opinion, what do you think about the policy processes as a theoretical framework to understand the well-being indicators, and for a downtrodden people, so that because you mentioned about the policy cycle, in that there are 6-7 steps through which policy made, and then there is the agenda setting, and then there are a lot of things happens in that cycle. But when we talk about the policy processes, is about something which is still undermined by the state, which doesn't include the downtrodden people voices, and those power to decide agenda settings is not ever we factor in those policy processes actually.
Yeah, so I'm feeling ill-equipped to talk to you or advise you about your research, because it's such a different context to the work that I've done predominantly in the UK. And I would say that it's a challenge at the best of times to get well-being indicators taken seriously in policy, and to argue for well-being work to happen, and even more so for excluded groups whose voices we might never hear. And I think that one of the key things that's important and I'm sure it's important in your context too, is to develop relationships within the policy community. So relationships really matter, and anybody who works in policy will tell you that. A lot of policy and politics are around building relationships, building coalitions of influence, and also being trusted as a researcher. So there's a lot of think tanks and other sort of groups that specialize in gathering research quickly and presenting it to policymakers in accessible ways for policymakers to take and use. But also what we overlook are the long-standing relationships that policy have with particular researchers that they've had for a long time and that they really trust in certain policy areas. So if you can, and I have no idea what the policy, I mean, obviously I've read about some of the issues in India and the leadership right now and other issues, but I don't know what your research focus is and what you're trying to get out of this in terms of policy, what exactly you're trying to affect, whether that's some sort of national change or local governance change. So that would depend on what you're trying to achieve, the relationships that you were wanting to build. But I would suggest that you try, and it might be very difficult, to try and build relationships with people that you want to see the research before the research actually is finished, and to draw them in and to use stories and qualitative evidence. So whilst policymakers often want the numbers, they often remember the stories, and they can often be the things that they tell to other policymakers to try and persuade them to do something about something. So I don't know if any of that helps you.
Yeah, thank you. It helps.
Okay. Good luck with your research.
And thank you to Hendra. And I think that engagement that you just had with Hendra really brings me back to when I first became engaged with your work. And I think one of the big takeaways from me was that you highlighted the importance of that engagement with policymakers. And that's not something the capability approach emphasizes so much from my experience. It's very much that engagement with the individuals and participatory approaches. But I think that lesson of the value of engaging with people early, that engaging with the decision makers is a really valuable takeaway.
Yes, and I did a piece of work for DEFRA on looking at the impact of evaluations on policy. So after almost every policy, there's an evaluation. And often those evaluations don't make any difference. They're not taken up, or they're not seen as robust enough, or there's a number of problems with evaluations, as I mentioned in my talk. So I did a whole piece of research within DEFRA to interview policymakers and their stakeholders and to look for really successful evaluations and why they were successful. And it wasn't around well-being, it was around environmental issues. But one of the things that came out of that, which I really do think from my experience, it works across all policy and not just in evaluation and about environmental issues, is that relationships really matter. And often the model is to do the policy, get it evaluated by an outside consultant, deliver a report to the policymaker, and then the policymaker reads it and might take something from it or not. So that's a sort of standard model. But I found that the really successful evaluations was where evaluation and the evaluator was brought into the policymaking process right at the start, and actually followed the policymaking process all the way through and really understood and built relationships with the policymakers so that they could then report on things that were meaningful to policy, instead of being a sort of, and this separation of research and policy is a throwback to the idea of rational policymaking, that evidence is produced outside and then is given to policy in a very unbiased and impartial way. And that's really not how things work anyway. So we need to reflect the reality and to embrace it and to work in co-production and to work in relationship with people to create evidence and better policy. So, and I think that goes through all the policy stages really. So yes, relationship matter.
Thank you, Karen. I might move over to Gwyneth Llewellyn now. Gwyneth, it's lovely to see you here on this platform. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you, Kate. And thank you, Dr. Scott or Karen. That was excellent. And your last point, very pertinent to the question I'd like to ask you. I'd be really interested in your point of view, which relates to your last slide, which is still sitting on our screens, about how to create more justice about wellbeing indicators by and with a group of people who ipso facto are assumed not to experience wellbeing. In this case, persons with disability. And you notice Kate said, lovely to see me. That's because Kate and I have done some things together. I work with people with disability as a researcher, advocate, in many different hats on, engage very much with our national and state level conversations about this with policymakers. But it's difficult when a group is thought about in society as unlikely to experience well-being because of the attitudes that we hold towards people with disability. So I'd be really interested in your thoughts about this, and your last comments, of course, about co-production or co-design, inclusive research and policymakers working together is very much at the forefront in disability research, as you would know.
Yes, thank you for that. Is it Gwyneth? Is that right?
Yeah, Gwyneth, yeah.
Gwyneth, thank you for that. So I'm reminded of some research, and I'm struggling to bring the researcher's name to mind now. Terrible with names, but there's some really interesting research done by a couple of researchers on how ableist the wellbeing agenda was, and that I read that quite early in my PhD, and I was really struck by it. So I completely get what you're saying, and I've been thinking about that very much actually from my interest in looking at epistemic injustice and also the history of well-being ideas, because I teach the history of well-being ideas from Aristotle and Confucius to the present day, and I cover the capabilities approach and other things to my undergraduate students. And I've been thinking about this I've been thinking about this ableist critique of well-being indicators. And if we look at the, people in policy often go back to Aristotle and say, oh, this is where the flourishing idea came from. But if all of the narratives about the ancient Greeks and Aristotle himself, of course, was an elite male active person, able-bodied person, who was in a culture of sort of promoting the able body and doing things with the body, so sailing and doing all of the very physical acts that are associated with being an ancient Greek. And I was thinking about that in the context of not only disability, but also in terms of gender. So you would thought there were no women in the history of well-being because most of well-being, so, Bentham, Aristotle, all of these big names are all men writing about well-being and happiness. You would have thought there was very few women who, existed in history. So I'm very interested in those discourses and narratives, which are quite, so in the one hand, they're seen as quite neutral. And, we just need to, if we gather well-being indicators on, whatever, on employment, we can just disaggregate that into different groups, or we can disaggregate that by gender or disability or whatever. And that's enough. But as Elizabeth Anderson writes, she's talking mainly about health indicators, but she also writes about well-being indicators as well, but in this particular context, she's talking about health indicators. And she discusses the fact that we need to have these experiences before we actually design the well-being indicators, because it's not enough to just disaggregate indicators into different people's experience, because often we're not asking the right questions to start with. So I think what you raise is a really important point. And I do think that certain groups get missed and certain life experiences are not collected. Collected being a very extractive term for something that really shouldn't be extractive. So yeah, does that answer at all your question. I'm going to see if I can look up this. Maybe I'll give, if you're connected with Kate, I'll give Kate the reference that I just mentioned. I can't remember. So you might have already read it, but it's quite a useful paper, I think, you know, focusing on what you've just raised.
No, I think what you said is very helpful, and I actually work with a theologian, and we have actually published in with Tom Shakespeare in Disability and Society on this.
I know Tom
this
Shakespeare.
Notion of whether the Aristotelian values are helpful to think about the lives of people with disabilities. So we have actually published some data on that.
Oh,
but
right.
it's a very challenging question. Yeah, it's a very challenging question. And in fact, I literally have come off a meeting today where the same issue keeps coming up, because people with lived experience of disability will talk about their lives in terms of well-being. And you could just watch people's faces. We're all on Zoom at the moment because of lockdowns. You can watch people's faces sort of thinking, well, how could they be talking about well-being in their lives? Because this is what their life looks like. So there's such an ableist view in society generally, and certainly typically amongst policymakers, that you've got to be able to break through that before you can even start to, as you say, try to create a situation where there's epistemic justice, really, to the lives that people are actually living.
Absolutely. And
there's this,
yes, absolutely. And I think
and this is a very big challenge.
I completely agree. And I think it's been on my mind, certainly in recent years, when we've seen other discriminated against groups and other excluded groups, their issues rise to prominence and actually create change. So, you know, the Me Too movement, and we're going through a huge wave of feminism around all sorts of issues across the world. And the same with race. And of course, all of those things are incredibly important. And I don't want to get into a terrible, one of those awful cul-de-sac conversations about which discrimination is more worthy of, you know, but it is very striking that some discriminated against groups still really struggle to have their issues dramatized in such a massive way in the public domain. So I think that's you know, a really valid point, and thanks for raising that.
Well, thank you for your comments too, and thank you for the seminar, the webinar, which, and Kate, I'm not sure if I'm actually meant to do this or allowed to do this, but I would like to send the recording link to some of my colleagues, particularly in some of the policy situations or the context. Are we allowed to forward on?
Yeah, it's open to all. So
the recorded link. Okay, great.
Anyone is welcome.
Okay, fantastic. I shall certainly be doing that. Thanks, Kate.
I'll have a bunch of policymakers emailing me to say, oh, it's not like that.
No, I don't think so. I think they're very aware of the difficulties, but we're all trying to find ways through it.
Yes.
And, you know, a lot of it is very collaborative. We're just trying to find ways through this, and it is actually challenging. I'd have to say it is challenging. So thank you, and thank you again for your presentation.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
I'm going to jump in and see if we have about 5 minutes remaining for this webinar, and maybe we can go a tad over if people are okay with that, just a couple of minutes. And we wanted to try to get one more question from the audience, and then we'll draw this to a close. But just want to say, very much enjoying listening to these conversations and hearing so much lived experience passed from person to person. I think it seems to be what this is all about. So we had a question from Jonathan. So if Jonathan is still there, you're welcome to unmute and join in, please.
Thanks a lot, Travis, and thanks so much, Karen, for terrific presentation and really brilliant to hear about your work.
Thank you.
And I wanted to ask a about your thoughts on the relationship between the value of participatory approaches to establishing indicators at a local level on the one hand, and on the other hand, the political efficacy of indicators that enable comparison between places. So I guess this is kind of a classic question for democratic approaches to indicators, but it's one that I'm thinking about in my own work at the moment. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. Are there kind of technical solutions to that challenge? Are there ways in which you would set aside the binary? Or yeah, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. Thanks a lot.
Yes, thank you. This is an issue that we really grappled with when I worked in the local authority. So the local authority was a district authority at the time. It's now been abolished and amalgamated into a county-wide council. So, but there was another wellbeing indicator set being developed at the level of the county, and then of course the national government was talking about quality of life indicators, and of course with all of the targets and expectations on local authorities and the need to justify, you know, how good you're being in various different ways on various different policy issues compared, and the way that we normally do that is compare it to how other people are doing. So there's this sort of comparative mode of targets that creates these tensions. So I would sort of, you know, it's difficult to challenge that. I don't think it's the best way to actually create a baseline for improvement, to compare yourself with other people. But that's sort of what we're stuck with in the end. And it would be hard and unrealistic for me to say, let's just abolish that, because, you know, it's not like that. But I think that, and you know, to be honest, we never resolve this. I think it's just an ongoing conundrum. It's a wicked problem in a way. But we tried to work closely with the county, and we tried to work with other local authorities. And I think lots of local authorities at the time were trying to produce their own indicators, and particularly people like Bristol Local Authority were doing that. And so it's not necessarily about, I mean, it partly is about producing indicators from that particular context, but it's also about producing indicators in a different way, in a participatory way. And when you do that, there are more commonalities across communities than you might think. I think the main thing is to produce them in a different, less technocratic way, and then try and promote that work everywhere. And again, that might be realistic, but that if you have the same work in all local authorities, then the comparisons then become slightly easier. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. That's a very, very interesting way of thinking about it. Thanks so much.
Okay.
All right, thank you. We were doing a little bit of behind the scenes work as well. There are a few other questions that remain, so thank you to those who asked them. We'll do our best to seed some of those questions over to Karen, and maybe people can reply via email and continue the conversation. I want to take a moment to thank the audience for really the participatory nature of this conversation, and so many interesting questions. And also my colleagues who have helped to work through this webinar series. It's just been an interesting forum, and I feel like the point that we're getting to is really practical, and says a lot about what we're trying to focus on and what everyone is working on together. This webinar series will be closing with a presentation by Sabina Alkire, who's working with OFI on the the Multidimensional Poverty Index, and has also done some research on participatory methods. So again, we'll be returning to the same theme in the next webinar. I want to thank Dr. Scott very much for her time and her expertise. And if you have any closing remarks or comments that you'd like to leave us with, please feel free.
Just to thank you again for this lovely experience, and to thank everybody for turning up and listening. And I'd be really happy to answer questions by email. And thanks to the people who did ask questions, really, really good questions, and I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Okay.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.